Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Kent, and I welcome all the in-person people here, as well as the online people, to a launch of two new books of prose by two Hamilton writers, Daniel Coleman and John Terpstra. The St. Thomas Poetry Series, of course, publishes books of poetry, primarily, Christian poetry, but we've had a lot of events linked to nonfiction prose, as John will know, over the years. And so today, the two books fall under that category and lean towards, well, one certainly a long way in the direction of memoir and the other in that direction as well. The exploration of the Canadian relationship with the First Nations is Daniel's subject, and John's subject, of course, is his life as both a woodworker and as a writer. Let me say a few words about Daniel, first of all. He recently retired from the Department of English at McMaster University, where he had taught since 1997, and he has been the author of several very important books, including White Civility, which won the Raymond Klibansky Prize, and Yardwork, a biography of an urban place, which was shortlisted for the RBC Taylor Prize. He is no stranger to memoir, in fact, having published, among other things, The Scent of Eucalyptus, about his childhood in Ethiopia with his missionary parents, and others. And he's going to be reading from his newest book, Grandfather of the Treaties, Finding Our Future Through the Wampum Covenant. Now, given this subject, I've asked, and they've agreed, that Daniel is first of all going to give a thanksgiving, and then John is going to give a land acknowledgement, and then we'll go to Daniel's reading. Okay, so Daniel, you're first.
Thank you, David, and it's a real pleasure to be here. This series has run for over 30 years and has welcomed and promoted the writing and proclamation of Canadian poetry for many years, and so it's an honor to be here. Thank you for the work you've done for so many years to do that. And I also want to thank John for inviting me to share the podium with him today. We've been walking and talking partners for a long time, basically learning about the place in which we live. And these books that we're both presenting have a lot to do. They grow out of the places where we live and are about the place learning, if you want to put it that way, that each of us has done. I'm going to read a Thanksgiving address from one of the two books that I've published this year. This one is called Deo Hahage, Sharing the River of Life. Deo Hahage in the Cayuga language means the two paths or the two roads, and it refers to the two-row wampum. Many of us have grown accustomed to the new tradition of having land acknowledgements at the beginning of important gatherings. The people I've been learning from through the wampum studies I've done over the last number of years, their tradition is to have what's called the Ahondong Gariwadego, which is the words that come before all else that is said at the beginning of any important meeting, and it's meant to put us in a good mind. You could hear it as a poem of stanzas that proceed from low to high, greeting the beings of earth that make our lives possible, so that as we review these beings that make it possible for us to be alive in the places that we live in, that it puts us in a good state of mind to remind ourselves of these things. I'm going to read this from Deo Hahage, and it's written by my colleague and friend Kian Debicki, which she translated from Mohawk into her own poetic stanzas. So here we go. We greet the human beings, all those people who are part of our lives, seen and unseen, who share their gifts for the good of all. And at the end of each of these stanzas, I'll repeat this phrase, and that is how our minds should be. We greet with loving kindness our Mother Earth, she who provides for all our needs and gives us home, a ground in the endless expanse of space. And this is how our minds should be. To the grass people, the plant nation, we give greetings and respect. You who are made of sunshine and dew and cradle our feet as we walk about the earth, we love you. And this is how our minds should be. To the hanging fruits, the berries and tree foods, we thank you. Sky Woman brought heartberries from the spirit world, and their medicine sustains us. This is how our minds should be. To the tree nation, we send such love. You give us breath, shade, food, beauty, and health. You give us the paper upon which this book is printed. Maple is the leader, the first to waken spring, a practiced rebirther. This is how our minds should be. To the game animals, our elder kin, who have always shown us how to live well in this place, thank you. You give of yourselves so that we may live. May we never take you for granted. And this is how our minds should be. To the waters everywhere, the lakes are the leaders. Let us give thanks to Ganyanderio, Lake Ontario, our life sustainer. And this is how our minds should be. We give love and respect to the sustenance, the foods that keep us here. The three sisters lead us. Ask us to remember how to live together in cooperation. And this is how our minds should be. To the winds, the four directions, we thank you for the air we breathe, for clearing away pollution, for bringing new weather and change. This too is how our minds should be. To the thunderers who keep the danger in the ground, who give love and respect, thank you for keeping us humble, for keeping us safe. You remind us of the power of our inner spark. This too is how our minds should be. Elder brother sun, you give us light, color, heat, vision, hope, such beauty. Without you, nothing would grow, nothing would live. Every morning you follow your duty and remind us that we too must remember our original instructions. This is how our minds should be. Our dear grandmother Moon, thank you for regulating the waters, for watching over those of us who create new life. Your shine shows us the way through darkness, and your beautiful face tells us we need not be perfect. And this is how our minds should be. Star Nation, thank you for connecting us, for giving us direction and intergenerational knowledge. You remind us to grasp the knowledge of where we come from with both hands and to look into the future and the past as we live our lives. And this is how our minds should be. Teachers of the past, such as Handsome Lake, thank you for your part in restoring our practice of giving thanks. We know your journeys in past days were not easy, just as ours are not easy. And you have given us much to reflect on about how our personal choices affect our spirits and minds. And this too is how our minds should be. Guardians, thank you for watching over us, for being such good ancestors. May we take up your modeling and also be good ancestors for future generations. And this is how our minds should be. To the one who made our bodies, sculpted us from clay, and breathed our spirits to life, thank you. Your creations are so beautiful. This world has so much to offer, and you have placed our feet upon its soil. May we relearn to be kind humans in your image. And this is how our minds should be.
I'll give a proper hello later. I just wanted to read this acknowledgement, which I wrote actually for our church in Hamilton. Toronto covers some of the same traditional territory, so I feel okay doing this. One note, in here it refers to a wounded only child, and this is a dual reference. It's both to the teacher in the gospel stories and to the teacher in the traditional stories as told by Tom Porter, who's a Bear Clan elder of the Mohawk Nation, in a book he wrote called And Grandma Said, Iroquois Teachings as Passed Down Through the Oral Tradition. The teacher in his grandma's story imparts the Creator's teachings to the Mohawk, and when they've learned and committed themselves to those teachings, he leaves and travels east across the ocean to bring the teachings to the people living on the other side. Many years later, he returns, wounded and bleeding, and reports that they wouldn't listen. We are gathered on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg and Huron-Wendat nations, to greet the Creator. We are gathered on the traditional free range of wolf and cougar, rattlesnake and bear, turtles on the bay shore, salmon in the water, eagles in the sky, the bur oak, black walnut, red maple and ash, maidenhair fern, picture plant, bloodroot, and the people of these and many other nations who are spread across this country as far as car can drive, canoe paddle, kayak glide, or foot fall. We follow a wounded only child, whom we ourselves may have wounded, through the woods and over creeks and streets of this good earth that we share, the landscapes of a life we are blessed to lead, who is our wilderness guide and spiritual outfitter, who slips between the trees and is gone, who sits beside us at an evening fire with story and song. We sing in the sacred Holy Spirit of life that fills every lung and shakes each leaf as if it were the only leaf, that blows spring-like through open windows, that flows and does not stop flowing as long as the earth turns, the sun rises, and the day begins.
I'm going to put these out here and then I'll pass them around in a little while. But John and I have planned to offer these words of introduction and land acknowledgement, and then to speak, I guess, each of us for about 20 minutes about the books that we've produced this year. And I can't remember, do we have time for discussion, question and answer kind of time at the end, or do we do that more down in the church hall? Down in the church hall afterwards, there's coffee and refreshments and a book table. So if you're wondering where you get these, there are some around. So my name is Daniel Coleman, and I'm grateful to be here with you all. As I said earlier, I know that this is a distinguished series here, and it's a real honor to be part of it today. And I know that there are people online. I think we wave over here at the cameras. I know that I have family and friends far away who are participating today. I know John does too. So welcome those who are participating virtually, and to all of you who are here, friends, family from close and far. It's really nice to see you. For those of you who haven't met me before, I'll just say some words of introduction about myself and how I got into the research and the work of producing Grandfather of the Treaties. finding our future through the Wampum Covenant. As David said, I was born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to parents, Canadian parents, who had taken the message of peace as they had learned it as children there. My mother went there when she was 19, my dad when he was in his early 20s. They met and married there, and us children were raised there. I came to live in Canada for the first time when I was 18, went to undergraduate school in Regina, Saskatchewan, and then did my PhD in Edmonton, Alberta, before moving eventually to McMaster to take up a professorship there. And because my family was based in Western Canada, we really didn't know anything about this part of the country. I had seen Hamilton from the overpass, of the Skyway Bridge of the QEW, and I knew that it was like dark satanic mills and something else, and was amazed when I arrived there at how beautiful the place was. The green world embraced by the Niagara Escarpment around the end of the lake. It was like the place was kind of shouting at you because it was so beautiful and so bruised at once that it was pretty hard to ignore that you were really in a distinctive place that had stories in it. And within months of arriving in Hamilton, I met John Terpstra because I asked colleagues like Lorraine York, who's in the audience here, who are the poets around here? Whose work should I put on my new classes? And John his name came up right away. And so I think you were visiting one of my classes in my very first year. And within a couple of years of my arriving, John had published Falling into a Place, this beautiful reflection on the literal land and its human and natural history right in the place where I lived. So I felt like John's writing was a way for me to learn where I was and how to live in this place let's go back to the Thanksgiving address, in a good-minded way. The other thing that happened when I first started teaching there was I asked colleagues like Lorraine and others who are Indigenous folks that I might invite to my classes to help me learn about the background of this place. And Rick Montour, his name was given to me. He's a Mohawk, now one of my colleagues, at the time a graduate student on campus. And he came and talked about these first agreements made between incoming Europeans and Indigenous peoples in North America. You may have seen these before or seen references to them. These are replicas of wampum made by Ken Miracle at Six Nations. This is the two-row wampum. It's a record, you could put it that way, of the ceremonial diplomatic meeting between the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee at the confluence of the Hudson River and the Mohawk River in the Albany region. And the story goes that they were saying, well, we don't want to live in conflict. The Haudenosaunee had already had armed conflict with Champlain up on the St. Lawrence, and they wanted to have peaceful relationships with these new arrivees. And so they said, let's share the river of life together. You're welcome to be on the river, and we noticed that you travel in a ship with sails, and we travel in canoes. And let's respect each other's culture or beliefs and ways of doing things by keeping our culture and beliefs and laws within our sailing vessels. The white background strips, for those of you who are online, I'll hold them up so you can see from farther away, aren't just white strips and background. They're 3 beads wide, 3 rows of 3 beads, and that represents peace, friendship, and respect. In other words, the rows they are separated, but they're joined. There's an intention to build relationship within the autonomous way of being that was being held up by the treaty. The Dutch are reported to have said, well, great, we'll welcome you to the family. You can be like our kids. And the Haudenosaunee said, hold up a minute. We're making a reciprocal agreement here. We could be like siblings. We don't want to be your kids. And because of that kind of understanding, they kept clear that they wanted to be allies of the incoming traders, if you want to put it that way, and not subjects. This becomes very important for the subsequent history of relationships between Six Nations and the Crown. The British arrive in the 1660s, and they really like that agreement, and they form what is known as the Covenant Chain of Friendship Agreement with the Haudenosaunee. And you could say that here's the ship of the two sides where you see the human figures. You know, it's like a cross-section of the two row, and you can actually see the join together of the linked arms, as they put it. The chiefs of the Haudenosaunee were known to have linked arms together to bind one another into long-term covenants of relationship, because they had formed a confederacy amongst six different nations, and so they were wanting to extend the same linked arms to the British. And the British, you know, they were coming from across the ocean. They had things like ropes and ships, or chains in their ships, so they said, well, we'll tie our ship to your shore, and we'll keep you tied to us. And so the rope between the linked arms got extended in the Covenant Chain of Friendship Agreement. And the British retained this relationship with the Haudenosaunee for 300 years. When, for example, Sir William Johnson became Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the British in the 1750s, he renewed this relationship repeatedly with Indigenous peoples of the Northeast. And then when the conflicts between France and Britain over the fur trade were intensifying and then declining after the conquest of Montreal, the British met with around 2,000 First Nations at Niagara Falls and formed this covenant chain with 24 different First Nations. The British were making wampum by that time themselves. They knew that this is how you do diplomacy in this part of the world. And so the Haudenosaunee form of agreement making became fused into the way in which British administrators and so on knew how to make agreements. So when we talk these days about nation-to-nation treaty agreements, these are kind of in the background of these wampum relationships that were made. And you may be wondering, well, how do you know this? These are pre-literacy forms of record keeping. How do you know what people said to one another? The Haudenosaunee had wampum keepers that passed on the story that went with each wampum. There are hundreds and hundreds of wampums. I'm only talking about two that were important for the basically British administration that evolved in northeastern America. But agreements like this were made. You've often heard, say, in land acknowledgements, references to the dish with one spoon wampum agreement. That was made between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee to share the land and to be living in peace together. And so there are many, many kinds of wampum. I asked Rick Hill, who made the illustrations for my book, at one point, who's been involved in wampum recovery since the 1970s. How many wampums have you managed to recover from museums around the world? And I was expecting him to say a big number, like 86 or something. And he said, I lost track at 600 and some. So we're talking about a massive literacy tradition that extends far beyond the things that we know in literate culture. But the other way that we know about what people said in these wampum agreements is that the British had their own Treaty Council minutes that record the references to the covenant chain, to the river of life, to the canoe and the ship, and so on. So part of my education, you could say, of the past decade has been to learn about these wampum traditions. Oh, I meant to pass these around so you can feel them, because these are replicas, as I said, made by please feel free to pass them back. I do need them back at the end because they're very expensive. So, and these are not made of the original shell beads out of which they were made. They were, can you imagine? They made them out of seashells with hand drills, you know, drilling little holes to get the threads through to make each bead of these thousands and thousands of beads. I've read that a wampum maker could make 36 to 42 beads in a day. So when they had one of these meetings to present a wampum, it took, you know, like 2 years of bead making to be ready to create the wampum. which is no wonder that Europeans thought wampum was money, because it was so magnificent and expensive to create. So I arrived in Hamilton and learned about these wampum agreements from people like Rick Montour and other Haudenosaunee neighbors in the 1990s, and was so moved by arriving in this place where I had no idea of this kind of diplomatic ceremonial history. You could say wampum is like a treaty law. I've been kind of referring to it that way, but it's almost like a vision prayer as well. Like it's exchanged in a very ceremonial context. So it's got that kind of refusal to divide the world of spirit, you could say, from the world of, mercantile law, and to bind these together as covenants. In 2000 and up until 2006, my field had been Canadian literary studies. I was very happy doing that kind of work. And many of you may remember, if you live in the region, that was a pretty hot year in relations between Indigenous communities and local municipalities, because there was a land reclamation that flared up. You could say it had been kind of boiling under the surface for a long time in 2006. And I was walking onto campus one day in April 20th of that year, and there were 30 police cars parked behind one of the student residences. And I thought, oh, the students have gone home for the summer, and maybe they're having a conference, for the police on campus, and learned later in the day that my university, McMaster, was the barracks for the 200 OPP officers armed with M16s and tasers that attacked the site, arrested elders and young people and all kinds of things at that site. So it was a moment where I kind of realized the apparently neutral academy where I was doing my studies was deeply invested in these relationships. And there wasn't like some neutral place or objective place where you could just like observe from the outside. It was happening right where I was. What I was teaching, what I was researching, was deeply related to these relationships. And the thing is, of course, in these years, we've all been learning that. We're sitting in a church. Churches have been learning about their relationship with Indigenous peoples in this country for a long time, and trying to figure out, what do we do about the broken and hurt relationships that we have? And right there in front of me, you could say, were these wampum relationships that were about peace, friendship, and respect, developed right here by our neighbors. And that was so attractive to me that I thought, I've got to learn. What is this? How does it work? So just within weeks of encountering the police on campus, I had been asked to serve as the academic co-chair of a President's Committee on Indigenous Issues, and that just meant that I happened to be on Six Nations Reserve a few weeks later, where there was a conversation about establishing a knowledge center at Six Nations. And the elders we were consulting with about establishing this research center were Lottie Key, Ima Johnson, Hubert Skye, and they said, you should call that new research center Deo Hahage, the title of that book, which means the two paths, which was a reference to the two-row wampum, because you're going to need the best of Western thinking and the best of Haudenosaunee thinking to create a knowledge center that will be able to archive our records and our histories and our knowledge and make that available to people around us. So I met with the then senior research coordinator for this new center, Rick Hill, and we were saying, I guess we need to figure out what the elders meant for us to do by establishing this knowledge of the two roads, of the two paths. And that put us into meeting once a month with both folks from the reserve and neighbors from around to say, what are these two roads, two paths? What does this covenant chain mean for us today? That was in 2007. We're now in 2025. So we've done a lot of work since then. The Knowledge Center exists and is thriving, has been receiving records back from the Smithsonian and the American Philosophical Society and all kinds of places. There's a rich archive of Haudenosaunee knowledge that's getting only richer every day. And we've also built the relationships to learn from one another. You see, these wampum that I'm passing around where you could say, based on concepts that emerged out of Haudenosaunee philosophy and thinking and law, but they were interpreted live in the diplomatic relationships with the Dutch and the British and so on. So, for example, the covenant chain of friendship. It's not by chance that that word covenant got associated with the covenant of friendship, because the people who first arrived in the area were Dutch, like John's ancestry is too. And the Dutch have this famous thing of having a covenant theology that was just emerging in the 17th century. You know, this is the period where the Dutch provinces are separating from the Catholic Church in Spain and establishing their own kind of new religion that became Protestantism, yes? And one of the major kind of philosophical basis of that shift was that it wasn't just that you inherited the directives of God down the order from the Pope through the bishops to the local people. God made covenants with people. This was what covenant theology was about. And it was about making reciprocal relationships with one another. So the Dutch had some concept when they arrived of covenant. And you didn't have to necessarily be the same religion to share that capacity to make covenants. So one of the things about the early relationship with the Dutch and then the British was that there was a kind of a different political theology available at the time that was quite different from how it had been expressed in New France, which gives us a lot of background to the tensions between New France and the Haudenosaunee and the British and so on, and how that worked out in the fur trade years. Maybe a last thing I should say, so that I make sure that John has his plenty of time, is that I'm so moved by the way in which these forms of diplomatic negotiation were based in a kind of spiritual practice that was earth-based. We will share the river of life with you, and you can travel in your vessel and we'll travel in our vessel, not so that we, can have great trade forever, which is part of it, but so that the river will thrive. The physicality of the place, the environmental value of the place was deeply embedded in the idea of why you did diplomacy at all. The speakers at the making of the covenant chain and the two-row agreement said that none of us will own the land, that's why we can share it together, and it will then be passed on to the faces waiting like seeds in the ground about to be born. That's the purpose of law, treaty, agreement making, is the faces waiting in the ground about to be born. So it's got this sense of the many kinds of life, plant life, human life, animal life, that are part of that upcoming intergenerational understanding of what a treaty is for. That covenant is a covenant with that grounded, landed future. So it seems to me that these agreements could teach us a lot about what our own laws could be about these days, especially as we become more and more concerned about the degradation of environmental sustainability and so on, and what it means to have things like economies that extract things from our environment, and how can there be seeds in the ground that will be able to be born long into the future. So this book has a section of history. You've got to have some history to understand some of these wampum agreements. It has a second section that's kind of, you could call it political philosophy, thinking through the philosophical implications of these kinds of agreements, and a third section that's called ecologies, and it's thinking about the ecological implications of these agreements. And I'll just read you a page from the ecologies section. And I've got to say, I know this is far away, but Rick Hill did the illustrations for this book. This is, maybe you can see it, it's kind of a turtle shape. Can you see that? That's somebody's signature from 1710, a clan signature that he's taken from like old manuscripts and things and used as parts of the section dividers and things in the book. So just read the book for the illustrations. But I will read a page here to just give you a sense of the tone of some of this part of how the book proceeds. The agreement to link arms is an agreement to share in peace the living earth. It's an agreement to make family. The people who make such an agreement emerge themselves out of the earth, who mothered them into being and who continues to nurture them every day. Their only chance of living in peace with one another depends upon living in peace with the living earth that keeps giving everything life, just as Terpstra said. That's the creator, one of the two creator twins. Although humans were meant to enjoy all of nature's gifts, no one will claim Mother Earth except rising faces which are about to be born. I understand this statement to mean that the participants in and beneficiaries of the agreement then, the ones who will thrive in the future, are pictured as seeds in the dark womb of Earth, as embryonic life embedded in the cycles of nature. The sun that warms the earth and generates days and seasons, the water that seeps down to the waiting seeds, soaking and quickening the tendrils of roots, the solar-powered photosynthesis that energizes chlorophyll every spring. These kernels in the earth, these future generations, are seen as having faces, distinct features, unique personhood. Reflecting on the ideas that grew into the practice of linking arms, the covenant chain agreement, from its origins in the creation story, a friend of mine who did some of the editorial work for this book, Amber Meadow Adams, puts it this way: we hold Earth first. How we hold her and how she in turn holds us is the blood that runs through every treaty, every policy, every law. We can't talk about what they mean and how we use them today with talking about each brother or family or nation or alliance and the kind of relationship each has grown with Yeti Nasta'a, Mother Earth. These are norms in Haudenosaunee ways of making agreements that rise from the ground itself. The people knew any agreements they made with other humans would need to benefit the rising faces which are about to be born, to submit to and cooperate with nature's way of being, her laws and requirements. This is the potential that lies in Aboriginal and treaty rights appearing in the Canadian Constitution. It's an opening for Canadians to link our ways of doing things back to the original instructions people received about how to live with good minds within the ecosystems that nurtured them. Long before the great law of peace, which brought the Haudenosaunee Confederacy together, the story of creation showed that peace is not a humans only thing. Any peace negotiated between people must also seek the peace of all things. Peace between the twin brothers required the orderly arrangement of separate spheres so that the beings they created could live in peace. It required the protection of each living being's chances of living and reproducing itself so that future generations could have the sustenance they needed to live. Later in the story, after the Creator had returned to Skyworld, it took a young man to observe that the plants and animals lived orderly, peaceful lives by living in families, each with its own duties. And the people likewise organized themselves in clans and families with their particular duties and responsibilities. As Seneca elder Henry Lickers puts it, we believed that by observing the natural laws of the earth, we would be able to learn the right way to live. As we studied the environment, we came to believe that we could achieve a state in which we could understand the instructions of the Creator. The quieting effect of the good mind came from putting things in order, from careful observation of the world's various beings and their various functions, from aligning one's heart and mind with the family of beings that makes up the natural order, aligning oneself with Mother Earth. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to hearing from John.
Just before I introduce John, I just wanted to interject a few notes of thanks myself. I want to thank Pat Kennedy and Margot Swiss who are overseeing the refreshments. Thank Don McLeod, who is overseeing the book table. Rigson Toot, whom you don't see, but he's back there, is running the live stream operation. I thank him. And I also thank St. Thomas's Church for their support over the years to allow us the use of the facilities here, and the support of a series of rectors. The most recent is Father Humphrey at the back there. Also Julie Armstrong and Christine Cover, who did the advertising in the Thurible and the weekly leaflet. I did a little research just before John comes up. I did a little research about when John read here for the first time, and I discovered it was 30 years ago, 1995, when we were about 7 years into the poetry series at that point. He was reading with Bernadette Rule, who's here. There she is, right there. John, of course, has been a very frequent guest over the years, contributing to this poetry series. We've published 3 books by him, but he's also appeared in 2 anthologies, and he's contributed to 3 pamphlets. We've launched several of his nonfiction books, and he's helped out in other ways at other readings, launching other people's books. And the night we celebrated George Johnson as well, which William Blissett organized. John was there for that. So he's been here many, many times, and by my count, this will be about his 18th appearance. In any event, I won't go on because just to welcome him again, once again, and ask him to read from his newest book, his memoir, that we're all looking forward to. John.
Thank you, David. I just want to say, continuing what Daniel was doing, that I've been reading a book called A Fair Country by John Ralston Saul, and he makes this astonishing point in that book that Canada is at least as influenced by its 400 years of interaction with Indigenous peoples as it is by its equal number of years of interaction with immigrants from Europe. And he goes on to talk about that. And I think what Daniel's doing is sort of helping to add that part, or to bring that part of the story into our consciousness nowadays, when it seems especially important that we distinguish ourselves from a certain large country that lies directly south of us. Thank you all for coming here today. And thank you also to those who are watching on live stream as well. I promised I would wave to you. So here it is, my royal wave, the Queen, right? Thank you most of all to David Kent, who has hosted more readings and launches of my books than I can remember, but apparently it's 18. Starting with a slim volume that was published in the late 90s called Devil's Punch Bowl. And I would be remiss not to also thank Margot Swiss and, where is she? She's there. And others behind the counter who organize the refreshments that always follows these events. And that they always make sure to provide Nanaimo bars, which happen to be my favorite. I may be distracted after this reading, so I just ask that you save me one. The book I'm launching here today is called A Carpentry of Words and Wood. It follows a path through my career as a poet and a writer, and as a cabinet maker and carpenter. I haven't brought any of my furniture here today, not a stick, but in the parish hall there's a table that has almost every book that I've published. I couldn't resist. I mean, how often do you have an opportunity to put everything or I was going to use the word oeuvre, but I can't say that word. I don't know how to pronounce it. How often do you have that kind of an opportunity? So there's only one, no, there's 2 volumes missing. One is the first one, which also sold out, but then the other one is Devil's Punch Bowl, which was one of the St. Thomas books that sold out, which is a pretty unusual thing for a book of poetry to do, let me tell you. So I'm going to start at the beginning of A Carpentry of Words and Wood, and then just wind my way through I'll wind my way through. The nice thing about a Gaspereau book is that there's the cover you can take off, and then the inside is equally attractive. The illustrations in this book are by the artist Wesley Bates. Do I have to keep track? Am I prone to overextend my time? I might. Scraping dried glued from the surface of a cherry wood panel recently released from the bar clamps, I find myself thinking that maybe it's time to say something about this translation of living trees into objects, into furniture. I have to put out of my mind what is happening to the trees of the forest in order to do what I do, in order to have done it for the past 40 years. Yet I have carried on to the cusp of retirement. And isn't that the story? Trees are beautiful and necessary for life on earth, and they are resource, employment for our hands. We show our love by cutting them down, killing them. Then we dissect their body and make work of their parts, shape things, build things, to atone for this barbarity. Humans exist by creative destruction. There's no evading that reality. Most of all, I love to work the body parts of the black cherry tree. I can make them into something beautiful for God and your living room through the ritual motions of my one-person woodshop. The craft is less magic or mystery than problem solving and muscle memory. The joinery of thought, memory, and feeling that a lifetime in woodworking requires is another story. I'll have to make that up as I go along, learn on the job, because trees are tricky, as are lifetimes, trickier than you'd think. Woodworking is an occupation I didn't so much choose as fall into in the middle of my 3rd decade, when I was flailing about for a form of employment that could keep me out of trouble financially and psychologically. It gave me something to do with my hands and kept me pure for the writing of poetry. For what is more pure than working with trees, other than the fact that you have to kill them first? I've been writing since the middle of my 2nd decade. The pleasures of woodcraft go deep, but are not as soul-satisfying as making a kind of furniture in the air. Over the past decades, a stack of poetry and nonfiction books has miraculously grown, each bearing on their spine a title that I dreamed up. I have no current plans to retire or give up pencil and keyboard. The words, God forbid, will have to retire from me. Their retreat is not impossible to imagine, having seen them abandon my mother. It's the right time to be reflective, but I find myself restive, resistant. Something in me does not yet want to be a tree. In grade 10, our English teacher assigned us the writing of a poem. I've told this story before, word for word, actually, in the afterword of a book called Call Me Home. It's my poetry origin story. The night before the assigned poem was due, I put a sheet of paper into my father's portable Smith Corona, typed the title of a recent Beatles song, Happiness is a Warm Gun, on top, and began to write short lines against the left margin, one after the other, to the bottom of the page. By the time I looked up, 3 things had been revealed. First, that this kind of activity was absolutely vital to the continuation of life on the planet. Second, that I had to do it. And third, that it had nothing to do with money. The first revelation had all the grandiosity of the adolescent built into it and was thrilling, and I still haven't really grown out of it. The second was a whisper in my ear of a life's calling, for which I gave humble and grateful thanks, and still do. The third affirmed my rebellion against a pragmatic immigrant upbringing and fit perfectly into those hippie times when opting out of the capitalist system was considered a virtue. Now, finally, I had an answer to my father's burning question: what are you going to do with your life? Poetry. This did not make him more confident in my future. At my first job making furniture in a small shop in a small town, if the door to our furniture showroom and shop was still locked when I arrived in the morning, I'd often sit in the car and try to advance a few precious syllables on whichever poem was currently before me. The tools for writing were light and always on board: paper, pencil. The process was excruciatingly slow, one word after another, moving from the left-hand margin to the line break somewhere in the middle of the page. I spent a lot of time staring out of the window. The tall hydro towers that lined the highway through the countryside were a prominent feature now of my daily drive to work. And because I had never used so many plugged-in tools so regularly, the wires that swung from tower to tower had taken on more meaning. The single insulated electrical vine that Tarzaned from the pole on the street to our shop was our slim, mythical connection to the power of one of the 7 natural wonders of the world, only an hour's drive away, Niagara Falls. From the celebration of the falls, a current of excitement lasts till beyond the town ahead, where it will stand houses round its maypole, make clothing in the Maytag dance, and keep the population up past dark. The power of the tool in my hand was a direct translation of water pouring over a cliff. Pretty basic. The pencil in my hand, meanwhile, powered by desire and imagination, and whoever and whatever I was at the time, slowly sketched enough poems to fill a book that was published midway through my 5-year stint making furniture in that small shop. The book was called Scrabbling for Repose. This was also a wonder, a book. I hadn't seen that one coming. I haven't written out or typed those lines from the poem Blondin on a Tightrope, which is the first poem in that book, in more than 40 years. Why would I? They're in print, and I can still recite them by heart. One of the pleasures of the process in those days was in writing out the poem at each session, from the first syllable to the last word that had distilled onto the page the day before, hoping that the momentum would prompt a few more words, a phrase maybe, an entire line or two if I was lucky. By the time the poem was done, the words were etched onto my memory. Tapping them out now on a completely different tool, I'm back sitting in the car, enjoying the familiar window trance, waiting for Jim to drive up, hoping that he'll take his time. At the risk of repeating myself, of all the native woods I've used in my woodworking projects, cherry is my preferred choice, both for its workability and its looks, its beauty. One of my favorite small cherry projects was a fireplace mantle and surround that I designed and made for a friend's newly installed gas fireplace. Unfortunately, she moved within a couple of years, and the new owner turned the house into student rentals, divided the living room in half, right through the middle of the wall where the fireplace had been, and the mantel disappeared. I filled the front hallway of a customer's house with cherry shelf units and cases with drawers to store all their travel history and literature. They loved to travel. The units were custom made to snug into various locations in the hallway and go up to the ceiling. When the customer moved house, they asked me to remove and custom remake them to fit new locations. For the same couple, I also made a cherry side table with a checkerboard top comprised of 64 two-inch square wood samples that she provided from her work as a specialist in trees. A flat drawer slid out from under the top with an identification chart. I ran into the husband the other day and learned that his wife had passed away in his care. One by one, the trees of her memory had been felled by dementia. I bumped into another customer who reminded me that I had made a bed for her and her husband, their marital bed, out of cherry. This is one meaning of community, that you can make something as intimate as a marriage bed and still be on speaking terms with the partners when they arise together many mornings later. A second meaning of community is that I can walk down certain streets and tell you what I made in this house or that house, indoors or out, for this or that person. It reminds me of a story my mother told me about her own father touring her through their neighborhood in Leeuwarden, in Friesland, and pointing out the houses made by his father, her father's father, distinguished from the others by their signature brickwork. Like the trees of the forest, everything is connected to everything else, and so is everybody, past and present. Branches touch and click and intertwine overhead. Follow one root, and before you know it, you're climbing up the trunk of another tree. I've written both prose and poetry, hence this little bit here. Prose is different, but the same as poetry. Both are writing. One word follows the other. Prose sentences travel from the left to the right-hand margin of the page. They are built into fairly solid blocks that fill a page from top to bottom. The blocks carry on and build for page after page. Prose is a carpentry project, a renovation, or an addition. Poetry is more akin to making furniture. It's on a smaller scale, where everything shows. Generally speaking, people make no distinction between furniture and carpentry. Furniture making and carpentry. It's all carpentry. Likewise, audiences generally tend to make no distinction between the poetry and the prose they hear me read aloud. To them, it's all poetry, or so they have said. And it's a very nice compliment, one that I take to heart. I have learned to be less categorical. It's all writing. One word follows the other. They go for a walk. Poems are prompted by emotional circumstances that cry for articulation or expression. Their lines don't make it all the way to the right-hand margin because they are overwhelmed by meaning or feeling and need to pause and catch their breath. Poems are prompted by occasion or place, by an idea, or by being asked, by something funny. They start as an urge, an itch. They enter through the front door, the side door, or an attic window. Sometimes they knock. I'm telling a story, and someone says, "That sounds like a poem." I say thanks and go find a pencil. I have written using poetic forms only a few times, although my first favorite poet, Richard Wilbur, was a master. It doesn't come naturally, but maybe I haven't tried hard enough. I take comfort in and cling to poetry defined as memorable speech, a descriptive phrase by W.H. Auden, one that he later wished he could take back. A poem seeks its own voice, its own way of saying. People tell me that they hear my voice in their heads when they read a poem or a book later after they've heard me give a reading. Another very nice compliment, one which I also take to heart and find a bit scary. What am I doing inside their head? Words sometimes want to get organized in the right order and fall into place right off the bat, but they'll just as often fight every inch of the way for the sheer pleasure of seeing you squirm and rage and despair. Tinkering is required, but not too much or you're edited to death. You don't know the job is done until you hear the click. That's the last nail driven into the window trim. Pack up the tools, lock the door behind you. It's over, finished. It can't be redone or undone. There is a feeling of elation and relief as well as grief. Fortunately, it's replicable, this process. Sooner or later, the poet knows not when. The prose writer has more options, projects lined up or on the go. Sometimes the click never comes. A prose project is a job you sign up for that guarantees employment for the foreseeable future. It requires putting in the time, racking up the mileage. There's less sitting around, waiting, less time leaning against a tree. You're more likely to take the tree down, mill it into lumber. The consuming requirements of prose can be distracting and keep you away from the poetic feels. The two are not mutually exclusive, but they are sometimes incompatible, left hand, right hand. If both the prose and poetry are being elusive or uncooperative, for me there is always the woodshop, where a few hours will produce something tangible to show for my efforts, something practical and possibly even beautiful. I'll feel better too. No one is required to write poetry, after all, or prose that sounds like poetry. Nothing is hanging in the balance, unless it's the universe. No one has to make furniture in a woodshop either, for that matter. That's why IKEA exists. It's more useful and profitable to build additions and do renovations. Plus, on the job site, you're not alone all the time. Your social skills stay sharp. You don't talk to yourself as much. Poetry is a calling to which a poet may have to be recalled, as in recommit themselves, be reminded of, given the exigencies and distractions of life on earth. Another meaning of community is when an acquaintance, someone you have not seen in a while, provides the nudge, gently. Still making furniture? No, it's mostly carpentry these days. Oh, too bad. Still writing poetry? No, it's mostly prose these days. Oh, too bad. Did my interlocutor even remember our brief conversation? I never presume to think that I have another poem in me. Each is ever and always a gift. When I am writing, it feels as though I have always been writing and always will. When I am not writing, it feels as though I have never written a thing and never will. A book, of poetry or of prose, is a tree that grows one leaf at a time. Q&A. What do you do? Classic question. One that I automatically ask others. What's your occupation? I invariably prevaricate and introduce myself as a woodworker, cabinet maker, or carpenter, rather than as a writer or as a poet, God forbid. It makes me seem more like a normal person. I won't have to explain myself. Most people suspect that this answer is not the whole story. Do you call yourself a poet? See above. The only time I voluntarily referred to myself as a poet was during the brief stint as convener as the finance committee of our church. While making a monetary announcement on one Sunday morning, I said, "It says a lot about what kind of community this is that they put a poet in charge of the money." I was looking for a laugh and got one. Poet is a title given by others. As in the children's book, when the starving mice say to their dreamy friend, "Frederick, you're a poet." I do not claim it for myself. I write words in lines that do not go to the right-hand margin of the page and indent in unusual ways, and like to speak these things aloud to others, memorably, if at all possible. Where do you place yourself in the grand literary scheme of things? I am not a schemer. I try not to look up from the plow. I may have shot myself in the foot anyway and lost all literary credibility by publishing, to date, 2 books of prayers. In the grand scheme of things, it helps to recall one Sunday morning when I was complaining to a fellow parishioner outside the church steps about the low trajectory of my literary career. She looked me in the eye and said, "Don't you dare ever underestimate the value of what you do here." Thank you. I needed that. Any career high points? Governor General Adrian Clarkson reading an Advent poem of mine called "The Little Towns of Bethlehem" with musical accompaniment on CBC radio at Christmas several years running. A Bookmarks Canada plaque with the poem "Giants" printed on it in Sam Lawrence Park on the edge of the Niagara Escarpment overlooking downtown Hamilton. The mother of a 5-year-old telling me that her child had memorized the poem. There were other highlights too. A box of books is delivered to the front door. It's from my publisher. I open up the box and line the books up on one of the shelves in the closet next to my other books. Or I leave them in the box and stack the box on top of the other boxes in the closet. Each box holds at least 25 books. It may take months, it may take years, but eventually, through readings, requests, and gifts, the shelves will empty out and I will have to order more. This has been my experience. My books have never sold in huge numbers, even when they've won prizes. I receive annual royalty statements and remind myself that it isn't about the numbers. I'm not in it for the money, obviously, but I never meant to take it to these extremes. I am fortunate to have publishers who haven't bailed on me. Is it the nature of what I write that limits my audience and sales? Is it the lack of promotion and distribution, or my own lack of ambition? Is my gift too humble? Is the culture a wasteland? Will I be discovered only after I'm gone? Is my writing like the furniture I make, bespoke, custom-made to fit into a certain place in a specific household, an individual life? There is also this. You make a loaf of bread, your friends partake and say, Then you bake a new loaf in the morning. You write a poem, read it aloud to your friends. They make a similar sound as they chew on what you just said, on how you put it. Or they remain silent. The next day, or the day after, you write a new poem. Is it presumptuous to think that a poem should serve any more than the moment, even if it is only the moment of its creation? Or shall we allow the moment to be enough? Some days, I choose one of the books that has come into the house, in a box, one of the titles from my oeuvre, I still can't say it, and put it in my pocket as I leave the house, with the intention of leaving it behind in the hardware store or stationery store, the theater or the coffee shop. I'm dropping acorns. Why not? If an oak tree can drop its nuts at random, I can leave a book. Someone will find and crack it open, maybe eat it up. or bring it to their nest for winter reading, or just take a bite, abandon it, and leave it for the next bushy tale. Something in me is perfectly happy to be a tree. Thank you. I'm going to get water. I already did the Q&A.
Q&A will be in the hall. Thank you so much, Daniel and John, for inspirational readings, I think, and I'm sure many of you will want to acquire both of those books, and you can in the hall at the book table. And thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again. Thanks. Bye-bye. Door and then up some more stairs.